This is a response to Marcus, who posted a video linked below, in which he claimed that anti-feminists are not anti-feminist. He based this on his assertion that feminism is about equality, and cited Karen Straughn's practice of looking back to Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and their Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions on Women's Rights, which came out of the convention held at Seneca Falls in 1848. I used to make that same mistake. It's an easy one to make. We see celebrities asserting that feminism is, by definition, about equality, equal legal, political, and social rights for women. And yes, that's how it started back in 1848, although, as Turd-Flinging Monkey has noted, even then they did not want many of the responsibilities for women that go along with the rights for men. In his video, Marcus said that if anti-feminists are not opposing first-wave feminism's claim to equal rights with men, then we should call it something else. Well, I already tried that. From 1988 to sometime in the early 2000s, I distinguished between the feminists who, like Christina Hoff Sommers, Kathy Young, and Camille Paglia, espoused first-wave feminist equality, and feminists who, like Gloria Steinem, Robin Morgan, and Susan Brownmiller, wailed that women were all victims and men were all to blame. I called the latter pop feminists. But the term never really caught on. The most it did was when Susan Faludi accused Christina Hoff Sommers and Kathy Young of being pod feminists, who suffered from internalized misogyny because they adhered to first-wave feminist values while opposing second-wave feminist vices. And Kathy Young also, in her first book, or rather her second book, used the term pop feminist, but even then it never caught on. This demonstrated that the second wave really has nothing at all to do with the first. They're two separate movements connected only by a name. Expropriating names is a common practice among progressives. Libertarians used to be called liberals, but then progressives expropriated the name, and to distinguish themselves from progressives, the original liberals started calling themselves libertarians. Progressives in the United States tried to do the same thing to conservatism and flew under the radar of cognitive awareness by calling themselves neoconservatives or neocons, and they almost succeeded. But today, people are finally beginning to grasp that neocons are anything but conservative. They're progressives. So maybe the time has come when a term like pop feminist could catch on. But the truth is that second-wave feminism has virtually nothing to do with first-wave feminism. They're two distinct movements. Movements are identified and defined by those with the loudest voices who dominate the agenda. And since about 1963, second-wave feminism has wanted nothing to do with real gender equality, which was a positive goal, while continuing to assert that their goal was equality. Their agenda focused on blaming and shaming to control men, masculinity, and the patriarchy. This was only to be expected. As Eric Hoffer explained in his outstanding book, The True Believer, movements begin with thinkers who have an axe to grind. They articulate the complaints and ruminate about the solutions, but they seldom march in the streets brandishing torches and pitchforks. Enter the first-wave feminists. From Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in 1848 to John Stuart Mill, whose book The Subjection of Women was published in 1869, many people wrote and spoke about giving women the right to vote before the torch and pitchfork brigades entered the scene, which they eventually did years later. And it was not until 1920 that men finally gave women the right to vote in the United States. There ended the first wave of feminism. The second wave began in 1963 with the publication of Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. She was another intellectual with an axe to grind. Friedan asserted that white, upper-middle-class women were plagued by the problem that has no name. What she described would today be called clinical depression. But whatever you call it, white, upper-middle-class women had it. She cast women as victims, but did not blame men, claiming instead that men were fellow victims. That came a few years later when fellow socialists and the CIA, through Gloria Steinem, began to take over. From that point on, their goal was to destroy marriage. That meant they had to destroy men, which they set about to do by blaming men for all the ills ever to befall women, and to portray women as victims and men as their predators. Here truly began the second wave, and it had little to do with equality and much to do with hating on men. Because of this, it attracted Hoffer's true believers like moths to the flame, women whose lives were so devoid of meaning that they were desperate to find something bigger than themselves to which they could belong. They were fanatics who joined the torch and pitchfork brigades to march down the streets, spewing hatred for men. That is modern feminism. It had little to do with equality at the beginning and has nothing to do with it now. Hence, to be anti-feminist, you do not need to oppose gender equality. You don't need to oppose women voting. This is why I disagree with Christina Hoff Sommers and Kathy Young, who believe that the term feminism still has utility and can still be recovered. That said, in many of his 2016 videos, Turd-Flinging Monkey made a powerful argument to support the contention that giving women the right to vote guarantees the creation of a welfare state that elevates women with more and more rights by loading men down with more and more responsibilities. It turns women into a privileged class and men into serfs. But eventually, men will fight back. This is what I've been calling the backlash ever since 1993, and after more than 2 decades, we're finally beginning to see it today. And all because men gave women the right to vote. Now, I'm a live and let live kind of a guy. I'd like to think that women can be trusted with all the tools that adult men are required to use, but the evidence suggests we were better off when the equivalent rights and equivalent responsibilities of patriarchy were the rule of the land. The clear evidence of history teaches us that equal rights lead to unequal responsibilities, thanks to hypergamy, which leads women to vote for and use their vote to force gynocentrism down our throats. What are we to do about this? The first wave of feminism culminated almost a century ago with giving women the right to vote. This led to the second wave, which has nothing to do with equality. The third and fourth waves of feminism are not so much new waves, but more like ripples of the second wave, radiating out in the life cycle of mass movements Hoffer described in The True Believer. They are all really part of the second wave. The rape culture meme did not start with the third wave. It started in the 1970s with Susan Brownmiller and Mary Koss. The wage gap zombie that just won't die began in the 1980s. And with the exception of the cisgender and intersectionality nonsense, most of the memes that are attributed to the third wave were fully developed by the second wave. The Take Back the Night marches, chanting, "What do we want? Safe streets. When do we want them now?" That began in 1975. The lies about domestic violence in Super Bowl Sunday began in 1993. These were developed by second-wave feminists. The tools and tactics have changed, but just as the suffragists in 1920 were part of the same first-wave feminist movement that began 72 years before, in 1848, the third and fourth waves of feminism are part of the same second-wave movement that began only 54 years ago, in 1963. With the addition of a few nonsensical memes, they use all of the same lies. Most of their tactics and goals are all the same. Most of what has changed is the technology. In the 1960s, we didn't have the internet. And while the internet had started several years earlier with the advent of Usenet, the predecessor to the newsgroups and email, by the time Robert Schaefer and I started the Manosphere in 1995, he with his domain of the patriarchy and me with the Backlash at Backlash.com, the World Wide Web was only 4 years old, and just as people like Roosh, who now claims that it was the pickup artists who started the Manosphere, he didn't come along until years later, it was the same for the feminists, who did not start setting up websites until a few years after we did. Technology didn't make the men's rights movement a different movement, and it doesn't make feminism a different movement either. The second, third, and fourth waves of feminism are all the same movement. You can oppose this feminism and be an anti-feminist without opposing women's right to vote. Now recently, Aaron Clarey posted a few really good videos narrated by Davis Arini on this subject. These were How Women Failed Western Civilization, Yes, Men Do Leave the Market, and No Rings for Liberal Chicks. All three are linked below. For those of you watching this on Facebook or on Minds.com, sorry, I've got a cold, so I'm having trouble pronouncing some of these words, the links are all on the video at YouTube. I recommend all three of them, especially How Women Failed Western Civilization. In it, he observes that at this point it's virtually impossible to take the vote away from women, and we shouldn't because there are lots of women who are responsible and who do support men. That's all true. The problem is that women, like men, are motivated primarily by comfort. Why break out of your comfort zone when you don't have to? Those crazy feminist attention whores marching around blathering about being nasty women don't represent the majority of women, so we can just ignore them, right? That's what the majority of women have been saying, and it has allowed the feminists to take over the narrative and dictate laws. Back in the 1980s, for example, feminists got states all across the country to pass laws requiring police to arrest the aggressor when they were called to a home for a domestic violence disturbance. Feminists thought they had struck a blow for their cause, but then a funny thing happened. Women were being arrested in greater numbers than men. We thought this was very funny, and we were celebrating our own little victory. But then feminists got all the states to modify the laws to require them to arrest men, or at least to separate men from the household, because men are always the greater threat, after all. The facts were right there. Everybody knew this was bogus, and despite that men's rights advocates protested, feebly I might add, I know I was there, and that conservatives were too chicken shit to do anything about it because ever since Queen Victoria, conservatives have been obsessed with the idea that women are sweet and innocent while men are dirty, bad, nasty. So the nation rolled over and let it happen, even though guys like me were pointing out that it was wrong. And that's how it's been ever since. Even women who know better and don't buy into the feminist narrative about men have been going along with it, because most people are willing to passively accept benefits, even when those benefits are based on lies. So maybe we should go back to the days when the equivalent rights and equivalent responsibilities of patriarchy were the laws of the land. Maybe we should take away women's right to vote. There's a reason why Rebecca Traister wrote her recent article, The Future of the Left is Female. Numerically, the left is dominated by women, while the right is dominated by men. The left wants to take from the producers and give to the looters, and most of the producers are men, including millions of men with wives and children who depend on them. So what do you think? Should we follow Aaron's suggestion, enjoy the decline, and go along with the equal rights but not equal responsibilities of women, even though they passively accept the benefits and advantages? Or should we take the vote away from women? What do you think? Here's what I think. To borrow a phrase I first heard from Turd-flinging Monkey, 0 fucks given. It doesn't matter to me. I'll survive. In fact, I'll thrive no matter what. If women drive the West to collapse under the weight of the welfare state, millions of them and their beta male orbiters will die. But not me, unless somebody comes and kills me or I get sick. And while I think that President Trump will mitigate the decline and that automation will change things in ways we do not yet fully foresee, the crash and burn, according to Martin Armstrong's computer forecast, will begin in 2032. And me and mine will be fine. We'll thrive. And if during the recovery women still have the vote and still have equality, it will not be the feminist equality as supremacy cow shit, but something more closely approximating real gender equality. And that'll be okay too, because while most women will continue to choose more conventional gender roles, hypergamy you know, even if by then we have implemented a universal basic income and automated machines are doing most of the work, it takes nothing away from me if women have the freedom and the means to get educated and work. What does take away from me are the feminist hate-mongers of the second wave and their third and fourth ripples, with their all men are rapists, all men oppress all women, and other anti-patriarchy memes. That's what I oppose. That's why I am an anti-feminist, and why right now I believe that any man who gets married is a fool, because under the current laws, marriage is a trap that allows women to turn men into serfs off whom they can leech for a lifetime. And that's why I am both MGTOW and anti-feminist.